So let's talk about some tips for how to get ready for the lab portion of your anatomy and physiology course. So typically they are referred to as practicals, and most of the time, it can be different from class to class, but most of the time students are given a list of body parts or structures to memorize in a certain amount of time. And for example, we may start with the skeleton in Anatomy 1. We may divide the skeleton up into the axial part first and then the appendicular, or some professors may test on the whole skeletal system at one time. So it does vary, but either way, however your professor does it, this tip should still help you prepare to memorize all of those terms that you have to know. Now, we all know the best thing for a student to do is to spend time in the lab with the models or the specimens that you have access to. So if you're studying the axial skeleton, the best thing for you to do is spend time in the lab with your models, looking at them, touching them, getting really comfortable with all the ins and outs and all the features and all the structures. But there's times where we need to study and we're not at the lab or we're at home. What's the best way to study when we don't have access to the lab or models? Well, clearly we would revert to our textbook or our lab atlas. And a way to utilize that even better, or what I like to tell my students about personally, is to make copies of the images you're responsible for, the views you're responsible for whatever system that you're on. And you can find empty sheets like this already on the internet, free access, or you can make them yourself. And what I mean is sheets like this. So you can see this would be a great study tool to practice on at home for the muscular system, or maybe you're looking at the skull. And studying flat images is not nearly as effective as studying on the actual model. But again, we're talking about when we're at home and we're away from the lab or the models. And what I like to tell my students to do is once they've made their copy of their practice sheet, is to slip it inside of one of these page protectors, these plastic page protectors. So you're gonna slip it inside there. And many of my students keep a notebook just full of these. And then you're going to take a dry erase marker, and you can use this sheet to practice by writing in the terms in dry erase marker and labeling, as you can see, labeling with your dry erase marker. And I'm sure, like my students, you'll be required to spell the terms correctly. So this will also help you practice your spelling. And once you have finished labeling this view and this image, you simply just grab a paper towel and wipe off your work. You can do it again and again until you're absolutely sick of it. So that's a fantastic tip. My students use it all the time. Another thing that I like suggesting for them is to use the same technique, but to make it even a little bit more realistic. Again, this is second best to being in the lab, but as you can see, this image is an illustration. It's great. But if we want to make it a little bit more like in the lab with the model, I allow my students to take images of the actual structures in the lab on their phones, like this. And then when they go home, they can print these out and they can take different views, pictures of different views, and then they can slip those in the page protectors and do the same technique, which works really well too. And some students prefer that because they can take pictures in whatever angle they feel comfortable with or whichever angles they feel like they need extra help on. Now, you'll want to ask your professor if that's okay before you do it. There may be different rules for different professors, but I find that these techniques and the repetition, the practice over and over again of writing and wiping off and writing and wiping off really works well for my students. And I always tell them as well to divide the work up. Don't start until the last second. If you know you've got to learn 100 structures and you know you've got a week or 2 weeks, you're going to want to divide up those structures amongst those days. So I tell my students, let's focus on, when you go home, just focus on pages 3 and 4. And when you feel really comfortable with those, the next day we're going to go to pages 5 and 6 and keep building. If you try to flip around and look at everything and all the different things you can know about the skeletal system or muscular system, you may get overwhelmed. And then when you get overwhelmed, you can feel like giving up. So if you do it this way and you break it down in little pieces, it's going to make it much more manageable for you. And if you try this technique, I think you'll really like it. So let me know if you do.